So I was joking backstage, the first thing I do is figure out if this iPad's working. So please send questions. It'll be more fun. Welcome, everyone. We've got a great panel. We will talk a lot about innovation and a lot about the importance of partnership this meeting. But as Dr. Califf said on stage earlier this morning, innovation is only part of the problem. A big question is how we get innovation to people. That's what we're going to be talking about here today from a whole bunch of different perspectives. We have a great collection of speakers here. We've got Jay Bradner from Amgen. Explain the socks, Jay.
This is Greg Marchand of the Boston Bruins.
All right. Debi Brooks from the Fox Foundation, Lisa Earnhardt from Abbott, Liz Fowler from CMMI, and Mark Samuels from AbbVie Health. And we're going to get right into it. And I was thinking about how to structure this, and I think we actually can kind of approximate the journey from not even from idea to innovation to patient, but from need to innovation to patient. So we're just going to do that going through this crowd. And we have in Debi someone who has worked very closely with a patient that I think we all feel we know, and has, I mean, you all know Marty McFly. You've seen the movies. You've also watched the amazing documentary that came out. And you also have a moment of innovation that happened in the past year that really changes the game, Debi. So I thought maybe you could tell us about, you might not know about alpha-synuclein, but you will in a moment. But I was hoping you could tell us all about the moment of telling Michael J. Fox about the results earlier last year.
Okay, so, I was thinking about innovation and partnership in this, and I think
You're a partnership, you guys.
That's right. So Michael and I have a partnership. I think our organization was really built with how do you bring patients into the construct of getting the outcomes that they desire. In a disease like Parkinson's, which is so complex and has had a decent drug for decades that helps manage some of the symptoms some of the time, is it kind of falls between the cracks. It feels like, most neurologists think, we've nailed Parkinson's, and they couldn't be further from the truth. And yet there's so many unmet needs. And so our early idea was, how do we put patients at the center? And so how patients partner, or how our organization partners with all the other people in the ecosystem, is kind of the preamble for the recent breakthrough that I'm excited to share. We really, we had a big finding in late 2023, or early 2023. We announced the discovery of a biomarker that detects the presence of alpha-synuclein while people are alive. So imagine a disease, if you don't know Parkinson's, where you live with it for decades and nobody can prove that you have it until your brain goes to autopsy and we see evidence of a misfolded protein, alpha-synuclein, in the form of a Lewy body in the area of the brain that helps manage movement. And movement is kind of how most people think about PD, but it's a lot more than that. If you were Parkinson's patients, I don't have Parkinson's in my family, and when I started working at the Fox Foundation, I started to meet a lot of people, and boy, did they tell me all the things that weren't managed by their medications, and the ways that physicians didn't really heed much of that, and certainly there wasn't much of investment from pharma. And so we really started a process and built over time a way for us to kind of bring the patient needs to the center, but also the patient experience, and maybe leverage patient engagement to help solve the problems. And so one of our biggest investments was to actually look for biomarkers. And it's kind of interesting to think about, well, we were on two paths. One, to de-risk specific therapeutic programs. Our field is pretty nascent in terms of not a lot of novel targets. Genetics had just been linked to PD, so synuclein was the first gene found, and remains probably the highest scientific rationale because we see it in pathology and in cause, but we have 150 genes now that conferred some kind of risk. But this was the very beginning. But trying to understand, what is going on in the disease really required studying it in people, moving away from animal models where you have to give a disease to something and try to see what we can understand in terms of the heterogeneity of Parkinson's by studying patients. We invested early in this partnership with the patient community and principally the donor community, our philanthropists. We took on a task that I think this is, in one way, the biggest innovation. The fact that a patient group would commit to launching a large longitudinal natural history study with the hopes of finding biomarkers. I don't know of another group that's done that wasn't funded by the government. And so that's probably one innovation, and it comes from this partnership between the patient community wanting to provide the data to see if we could parse the disease better and increase disease understanding. It's part of our overall strategy of de-risking drug development. So while we would be working on advancing therapeutic targets, we really have been looking for some way to predict the progression of disease. So looking at symptoms at face value in a doctor's office gives you some insights, and that's how patients have been treated for centuries. But we really just had no idea how to go after underlying biology because we couldn't identify it while people were living. So what we did find after a partnership that has spanned about 15 years of starting a study with about 600 participants, and now has grown to it's on its way to about 4,000. This is the most deeply phenotyped group of both patients, originally controls. Actually, I am a control, so I've been in this study all along. But we also were adding at-risk folks, and what we now have is an ability to detect the presence of synuclein with a 90% accuracy rate in spinal fluid of Parkinson's patients. We also, because that study was built and had enrolled a lot of at-risk people, they've been on the same protocol. In many cases, people who were deemed at high risk based on genetic risk factors, a sleep disorder called REM behavioral sleep disorder, or just simply particularly poor smell. That group, under the same protocol, some of those people went on to get Parkinson's disease diagnoses over this time frame, and we can see in their early spinal fluid samples the presence of synuclein as well, in maybe as early as much as 10 years before symptoms emerge.
So that means you may have a test for detecting if someone will get Parkinson's.
They have the biology present. We think that means that they are at much higher risk, and we have a lot to do. I mean, one finding like this, which was, we could have done all this work, and by the way, I'd say by the time we had this finding, we had about $750 million in this study. We could have done all that and had nothing and still be looking. So it wasn't a guarantee, but nobody would take this on. So I think that partnership of bringing that patients in, and patients who want to see cures, convincing them that, biomarkers are actually one of the biggest catalysts for cures. And the Parkinson's patient community is a patient community that actually understands biomarkers pretty well because we really brought them along on this journey. But this new finding could not have been possible without philanthropy and the patient engagement. And when you ask people, are you willing to get a lumbar puncture every year for the entire time that you are in this study, people say yes, shockingly. Most of the sites didn't think we'd be able to get participants to say yes to these things, but spinal fluid was our best guess. We collected everything you can imagine, but it's just an exciting way to see how innovation and partnership could step in to do something that now is poised to really transform the field. I'd say we mapped out about $1 billion worth of follow-up questions just from the observation of the finding of the insights from this new assay. There's one genetic group that actually only 2/3 of them are testing positive on this biomarker. And we're still trying to understand if we go earlier and earlier with people that have high risk indicators. Will we see this earlier? How early does the biology begin? And we actually learned also in the study that the highest predicting risk factor for someone who will have a positive test is particularly poor smell.
Jay, I want to move to, I mean, this is a really good example of where we're often at early in the journey of understanding a disease, where you have things like disturbed sleep, poor smell, and this some knowledge of the biology. And you faced the problem of actually turning that kind of information into drugs. And we saw how long that journey that Debbie just took us on is. And for you, that's just the beginning sometimes. You have a partnership at the core of how you do this in Amgen with some folks in Iceland who were there. Talk a little bit about figuring out the genetics of the disease in a way that you can drug it.
Thanks, Matt. And honestly, first of all, Debbie, congratulations. It's such a big deal to have this biomarker, not just for the patients who appreciate then that they're at a different risk, but also for those of us making medicines. Because if you have this measurement that defines risk, then we can be more precise in who we might engage to study the possible benefit of a medicine. And I'm certain it will read through to medical impact for those patients.
We're seeing it already.
I'd love to hear that. Quite thematically similar, as it turns out, has been our investment in population genetics. It turns out, and it's a funny thing about science and disease, that if you have a really rare disease, the genetics are almost easy to figure out. But if you have a really common disease, like heart disease, like obesity and its related conditions, like cancer, the genetics are really hard to figure out. And that is because so many people have the disease, and all of us have such diverse genomes. And a brilliant scientist called Kari Stephenson, years ago, working in Iceland, realized that on that island, there was, the genes were sort of trapped. They didn't leave the island that often. And therefore, they were enriched. And so by characterizing...
Well, and there were records.
Correct. And that's what I was going to say. By characterizing the medical consequences of individuals on the island, a true partnership between patients, healthy individuals, and Icelandic scientists in the private sector, a company called Decode Genetics, connections were starting to emerge. Show me all the patients who are protected from Parkinson's. Show me all the patients that have Parkinson's. You find the disease alleles in one, you find the protective alleles in the other. And so in 2012, Amgen, the world's largest biotech company, just growing up at that time, bought Decode Genetics, which we now enjoy as our Amgen Research Reykjavik site. And this site has been sort of like a crystal ball for us. When we read something in the literature and we get interested in a pathway, we run it through the supercomputer and we say, is it real? Do mutations, natural variations in this gene, tend to protect or cause that disease? And what's more, now that this field of population genetics has exploded and the UK has a biobank and South Korea has organized its medical records, and the same is true in Finland with FinGen, and in the United States, we have a massive amount of data coming together through a veterans program. We can ask these questions of different genetic backgrounds, subtly different genetic backgrounds. And the power of seeing signals in multiple genetic backgrounds tells us, as drug hunters, that we're on the scent of something very important. And
Can you name a project that you think Amgen did because you have this data that might not have happened otherwise?
Matt, there's a number of them.
I know, but I want you to pick one.
We have a medicine that targets PCSK9 for cardiovascular disease. That medicine is called Repatha, and it protects against a risk factor. Turns out if you're born without PCSK9, you have a massively lower risk of having a heart attack.
There's an aerobics instructor in Texas, is the famous story.
Yeah. That's right. And this finding was initially made at a very small population level, but then blasted through the global population. We now know the exact amount of PCSK9 that you might have as a risk and have made a medicine that emulates that genetic benefit. We did the same thing with Lp(a). We know a lot about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol.
It's another cardiovascular risk factor.
And LDL and all that. And you take a statin maybe if you have that risk. There's another gene in your body called Lp(a), which makes an almost more potent nidus for plaque in the heart vessels. And we have a medicine, it's in phase 3 clinical trial, and so we don't know what that medicine is going to do just yet. But using these population measurements, we've been able to characterize the protective effect across many different populations, gives us confidence to invest behind this idea, and many, many more in other diseases. When we started to study obesity, we asked, well, in the Icelandic peoples, are there any genes that protect against developing obesity and the morbid complications of having elevated body mass? And a gene popped up called GIPR. And it turns out that if you have a mutation that mutes the effect of GIPR, you are protected from having obesity. And so we made a GIPR inhibitor. In any event, I think across all the 4 therapeutic areas that are priorities for us at Amgen, we try to harvest these genetic insights, build medicines upon them, then publish them to inform the world of these findings, as other people may do different things with the information.
So if you did 2 lessons there, just that if you ask Jay for one example, you will get 3. The other is that, and we all hope Amgen wins one for the GIPR. Lisa,
I've oddly enough never heard that joke.
I got to be original at least once a year. Lisa, you have a partnership with patients in a different way. You're really working to figure out how to partner with patients and doctors to get medical devices to people out in the field. Describe that for the audience.
Yeah, so it really is a transformative time in healthcare and specifically in medical technology. So at Abbott, we're really leading the way on some of the world's most challenging chronic conditions: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic pain, and movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. So every step of the way in the design, the development, the clinical research, we are engaged with both physicians and patients and healthcare providers to make sure that we really understand what the unmet needs are. And sometimes it's improving a health outcome. Oftentimes it can be driving further efficiencies, especially as we talk about healthcare shortages in the world and healthcare provider shortages and the challenges we're facing meeting the needs of the people that we serve. And so one great example is what we're doing in diabetes care, and that specifically we have a product. Historically, people used to have to prick their finger, multiple times a day to get their glucose values, so they could help, make decisions in terms of food and exercise and insulin. And we're able to do that now continuously with a continuous glucose monitor. So 24/7. We're helping people with diabetes manage their disease so they can live their life to the fullest. And this is just a great example of the work that we did to actually get this technology to market. But it doesn't just stop with approval. While it is on the market, 60 countries around the globe, there's just so much work we need to do to really drive access to that technology. And Matt, that's really where the partnership, even at a local level, happens, because there's work we need to do to ensure there's payment and access. And so we're working with various different stakeholders. In the U.S., it's CMS. In the private payer community around the globe, it's many government agencies. But it doesn't just stop there. Because we realize that even if we have all the right payment mechanisms in place, it's still that last mile to get people sort of educated and aware. And so we do national partnerships with organizations like the American Diabetes Association, which is working on educating people around the risks of diabetes. And what's really stunning right now, there's over 500 million people around the globe that suffer from diabetes. And right now, there are only 10 million people who use a continuous glucose monitor. So we can and will do better, but it's partnerships like with the American Diabetes Association around education, because if you're lucky enough to live and see healthcare providers in a community where there's an endocrinologist, you'll hear about a continuous glucose monitor, and chances are, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you're going to get one prescribed to you. The challenge is a lot of people are seeing primary care physicians. They may other people in their community who might see the signs of diabetes, but they're not even being diagnosed. And so we're actually doing a local partnership, which is really interesting. It's a community partnership in Stockton, California, where it's a future well community. We're really focused on how can we work with social services, everything it takes to deliver care, because we realize technology is a really important part of the equation It's necessary but not sufficient, right? And so what we're trying to do is really understand what it will take to really change the paradigm and really help people understand the benefits of technology like Freestyle Libre, continuous glucose monitor, and how it could really change their lives. And so it's an exciting time, and we're happy to be a big part of the story.
Liz, the audience actually asked me to ask the same question that I already had, which is, we just heard that it can take hundreds of millions of dollars to get a new biomarker. I don't think I'm surprising anyone in saying that there are controversies about the cost of drugs. Getting glucose monitors even to everyone who needs them and figuring out how that's cost-effective doesn't sound easy. Liz, how do we figure out how to get these innovations to people in a way that we can actually afford and gives us a net economic benefit for society?
Yeah, great question, and I love the setup for thinking about not just from the patient journey, but the innovations, and then thinking about the payment side. And for those who don't know, the CMS Innovation Center was created as part of the Affordable Care Act, and we test innovations in payment and care delivery. Is there a better way to provide care? Is there a better way to incentivize better outcomes? And so let me step back. One of the goals that we set when I came on and took this role is we want every patient in Medicare and the vast majority of Medicaid patients to have a quarterback or someone who is accountable for total cost of care and quality. So that primary care provider who's really looking out for that patient, coordinating with their specialists, coordinating with other providers in the system, and making sure that they get what they need. Everybody has a relative or a loved one who's tried to navigate our really complicated healthcare system, and something falls flat. So one of the ways that we think about partnership is actually working with patients and hearing about the patient journey and looking for those opportunities where something doesn't quite go right. Where is something falling flat? We recently mapped out the journey for patients with dementia. And we did the same thing with patients with sickle cell disease that informed some of our payment models. So what's not working right? Where does that journey fall down? And could there be a payment innovation that sort of helps incentivize better outcomes and access to these innovative therapies? And so in addition to the primary care models that we're testing, we also have models in the prescription drug space. We have a cell and gene therapy access model that's looking at paying based on outcomes. So we've chosen sickle.
So what does that look like if you're giving people cell and gene therapies, which if anyone doesn't know, what, 400 grand, something like that? How do you
more in the millions?
Yeah, more in the millions.
Very expensive. Patients that haven't had a lot of therapies out there where there's challenges, and very sick patients. We spend a lot of time talking to patients. I just talked to a patient who went through the therapy a couple of weeks ago, from multiple times in the hospital due to very severe pain episodes to having this, and you could describe it better.
Is that sickle cell that we're talking about then?
Sickle cell,
Yeah.
and I'll ask Jay. He can probably describe exactly how the science works, but modifying the genes, replacing it back through the therapy. And this patient we talked to was no longer in the hospital. He's now in school. He has a job. He has a normal life, like from hospitalization 3 to 4 times a month to a normal life. And so, but they're very expensive therapies. So how can we make it worthwhile to invest in those therapies? And that's what we're testing. We're seeing if we can negotiate an outcomes-based payment arrangement with the manufacturers. So that, and on behalf of states, so we see if that's possible. Can we agree on the outcomes? Can we agree on what that payment mechanism might look like? Can we agree on the terms if it turns out it doesn't work and you don't get the cures that we're looking for? And then states will come on board. So we're in the midst of this, so I can't say more about where we are, but if it works, it could potentially be a pathway to think about other very expensive but very transformational and curative therapies. We also have tests in other conditions like oncology. So we've tested a couple of models in the oncology care space where we're looking at providing an extra payment per month to help support some of those services that patients need. 24-hour care access to a nurse or somebody who can help them if they experience side effects that keeps them out of the hospital, maybe care at home. Somebody who's sort of, again, that quarterback who's looking at the whole spectrum of patient needs and really thinking about it from a patient perspective. And so I'm happy to talk about that more. I know you need to hear from everybody else, but more to come. But that's basically what we do. And so I think taking the collection of the input here.
A quick follow-up from the audience. You'd mentioned a patient journey mapping for dementia. Where can people find more on that?
On our website, we've put the whole map. I think you just search CMS Innovation Center or CMMI.
CMMI.
Yep.
And the name of the model is the guide model. And you should be able to find a link to the actual mapping and how we got there.
Mark, it really seems like the system here isn't built for a lot of these innovations, that we have to rebuild everything from the ground up every time we invent something.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of what everybody on the panel does. It's sort of my day in and day out job is to look at what the current and future barriers and opportunities are to innovation and to work in partnership with Liz and her team, with patient groups, obviously with manufacturers, with the states and others to try to drive both near and longer term opportunities. In the near term, the cell and gene therapy access model is a great model and innovation to think about it. As Liz was mentioning, if all goes well, right, you'll have a partnership between manufacturers. Now, in this case, it starts with just sickle cell disease. So right now there are 2, but there are quite a few coming up behind. With patient groups, with states, hopefully all the states, but at least the most populous ones, with the highest risk. Sickle cell is a disease where 45% of its population is in Medicaid currently. The idea really is really threefold, right? One, to get states the education they need, because there's so much that states don't know about what they frankly can do under current law and regulation, let alone in the future doing these outcome-based or value-based arrangements. Ultimately, I think the goal would be to start with something like the cell and gene therapy access model, move into an eventual, so if you have EPSDT, right, early periodic screening detection, and treatment on one end, and it focuses on prevention and provides a special benefit outside of, with its own regulatory construct, that you have something on the other end for curative or nearly curative therapies. Because in the end, everything seems expensive, but yet we're not adding it up, right? We talk about static savings and CBO scoring and whatever, but if you take what Liz mentioned, right? So you have a person that now is back to work, back to being sort of normal with their family, whatever, versus being in the hospital getting treatments, and you start adding up the ledger on one side or the other. Being able to have a benefit that encompasses all that and perhaps pays for a one-time curative or nearly curative therapy will be cost effective. And in fact, ICER is a little bit all over, but generally for a majority of these gene therapies have found them to be cost effective, right? If the average sort of spend for a sickle cell patient is $4 to $6 million, and a therapy is $2 million, then theoretically the system is getting at least $4 million of savings. Now, obviously that
and the problem
depends on the patient, and
no one notices they're collecting that money. It's almost a public health problem, right? It's that inaction is not having to treat the patient is the benefit, but no one realizes they're collecting those costs downstream.
Yeah, and there are issues obviously at every level, right? And with almost every disease state. CAR T, for example, and that's what you were mentioning, 400,000 or 500,000.
Yeah, I was thinking CAR T.
Yeah, but that's CAR T. So only 20% of eligible patients actually are receiving the therapy for lots of different reasons, but it's no longer a manufacturing issue. It's, community oncology is holding on to the patient, or it's that the REMS is confusing physicians and they don't quite know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. That's cancer for anyone as we jump around.
Yeah, sorry.
We're gonna hit every disease by the time we're done.
Yeah, and Parkinson's, for example, right? On the gene therapy side, there are 3 from one particular company and its subsidiaries, and there's quite a few more in the hopper. But interestingly, like we were talking about, there's no code for injecting anything into the brain. So you might have a lot of good therapy, but the doctor can't technically do the procedure to deliver the therapy. And so I think, and CMS is aware and starting with this, not only at CMMI, but frankly on the Medicare side as well. It's it's hard to catch all these little issues. And maybe we'll be lucky.
Jay had a thought here, I think.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. So by training, I'm a stem cell transplant physician and have cared for patients receiving these types of cell therapies. Amgen, we do not market or really even innovate cellular therapies or gene therapies, which could make me the right person to answer the question with no skin in the game, or the wrong person. But as I get deeper into my career, inventing and developing medicines, I too have become obsessed with access. It's like, if we build it, 10 years of drug hunting in a laboratory, if you build it, will they come? Will the patients receive this medicine? And more and more in my career, I'm seeing that the groups that really care about access, they have different scientists at the table at the start of the project. They don't invent a medicine that requires 75 manufacturing steps, 18 days, invented for the single patient, because they know it's going to be hard to bring that medicine to patients around the world. And even if our country, the United States, you can access it, well, good luck in the Nordics. And so at Amgen, our solution to this is that we focus on the types of medicines that prove to be scalable. But we partner with these process development people, these engineers that understand manufacturing at the very start of designing the molecule. I was a part of the group that developed the first CAR T-cell therapy. It's a miracle. Get to know that story out of the University of Pennsylvania. It is so hard to bring those medicines to patients around the world. And it turns out that the solution could be a little protein that basically is an adapter between your own healthy cells that are circulating in your body and don't require genetic manipulation outside the body, and the cancer cell, so-called the bispecific T-cell engager. That was a concept invented by
Now
one
he has
of
a
our
bias.
scientists.
That is.
And we have made those types of molecules. And
also-
maybe for sickle cell disease, rather than genetically engineering a blood stem cell outside the body, doing a bone marrow transplant and putting it back into the body, maybe it would be like a small molecule that just flips on the healthy version of hemoglobin that was turned off after you were born. And others, not at Amgen, are working on that problem. And so I think that this access problem is actually all of our problem.
Yeah.
And it's for sure one part cost and one part access, one part complexity, but also one part innovation. As they say, when you point the finger, there's 3 pointing at you. And so in our portfolio, we take really significant attention now to being shoulder to shoulder with the clinicians who in a prior life or in their current life treat these patients, the patient groups that can say, no, that doesn't work for me, you're measuring the wrong endpoint. I know you care about my kidneys because I have lupus, but I'm actually really tired, and that's what you should care about. And then the manufacturing organizations that say, that's a great idea, nobody can make that at population scale.
I want to ask Liz, and then I'll get back to Debbie. You've been dealing with this access problem and trying to innovate your way around it from inside the government for years now. Is there any one lesson, anything that you'd really like to change that actually seems tractable about making this less of a combination crazy maze Rube Goldberg machine that has to be redesigned constantly? I mean, is there anything staring you in the face that you feel like you can't do that maybe if you throw it out into the universe here, it might?
I mean, I've worked on health policy for 25 years. I worked on drafting the Affordable Care Act. I worked on drafting the Medicare Part D legislation as well. Our system is complex because we have multiple payers with multiple different interests who have patients for maybe not as long as it takes for them to see the benefits of investing in some of these therapies. I think that's part of the problem. We also have a regulatory structure and framework, at least in Medicare, that was developed in the 1960s and modified and updated, but a fee-for-service payment can't take into account these better outcomes, the higher quality, the patient perspective that we want. We're testing whether or not we can start measuring patient-based outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, just to what you said, Jay, what matters to the patient? Is there a way to build that into the payment system? So that's what we're measuring, rather than paying based on just fee-for-service. The more you do, the more you get, and really thinking about it more holistically. So is there one thing that I...
What's the silver bullet, Liz? Help us
Well,
solve
I
the crisis in healthcare.
I don't even want a silver. Are there any bullets?
It doesn't even need to be silver, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, and the Innovation Center, the way that it's written in the statute, and which is a little ironic because I helped work on it, and had I, with with hindsight, maybe it focuses so much on cost, but maybe what we need to do is really think about quality and quality outcomes instead of just looking at the cost and the bottom line, because it does get down to cost to whom, and how do you distribute that savings. And so by focusing so much on cost instead of focusing on the patient and the patient outcomes and what matters to the patient, I think we're sort of maybe barking up the wrong tree. So we've really come up with an approach to think about a quality pathway, and it turns out the woman leading our quality pathway turns out to be a childhood friend of Lisa's, as we discovered in the prep session. But really thinking more about quality, measuring quality, paying based on quality, focusing on quality instead of just focusing on the cost.
Yeah, I think
Debi,
too that-
I want to ask Debi, you've been allied with a particular group of patients for a few decades now. When you look at this and these questions of cost and quality, how do you think about it in the light of what people with Parkinson's experience?
It's pretty frustrating. And I guess one of the things I'd say before I go too deep on this, I think that I'm not so worried about innovation in the science. I am worried about how we deliver it to patients. I think we're really good at scientific innovation. But for instance, in Parkinson's, as an example, our population is treated by 3 different kinds of physicians. About 50% of Parkinson's patients are seen in primary care. By the way, people live with this disease for decades, and it is an insidious, burdensome disease, and they're still treated in primary care for their entire journey. About 25% are seen by a general neurologist, and only 25% ever get to a specialist. So just trying to figure out how you could deliver a new insight. I happen to live in Delaware, and there's one movement disorders specialist in the state of Delaware who really covers South Jersey, Delaware, part of Maryland. And he's got over 2,000 patients in his practice. And over the last 15 years, we've seen about 20-ish new therapies to manage symptoms. So I excitingly sit down with him and say, so how many of your patients isn't this great? And he goes, none of my patients can afford that. I have like a dozen people who are taking advantage of new medications. It's so frustrating. And I think, so this notion of it's hard enough. I mean, in Parkinson's, our big next step is really going after underlying biology and trying to slow the progression and hope that you have fewer symptoms to manage, or that we can prevent the onset of symptoms in totality. We're not close to that today, but we aren't far. We have a pretty good pipeline of things that are going to give us our first readouts with these biomarker tools in hand now, where we can get more insights about that. But how are, even in the therapeutics, this is a terrible story, but, like we had a new drug approved that's a device where it was so exciting to see a new delivery mechanism of getting these carbidopa-levodopa mix into the brain instead of trying to deliver these things through the bloodstream, which is, blood-brain barrier is tricky, as I'm not a scientist, but I'm sure all you guys know this. And so this was an inhaler. And we helped fund getting this applied, using this, delivering our drugs in a better way to the brain of Parkinson's patients. Very excited about it, goes the whole distance, gets approved. And the manufacturing process never engaged any Parkinson's patients. It literally requires a bang and a holding it, and this is what you're trying to do. You can't do it.
So you need like a family member to do it.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the grip strength anymore.
Yeah, and so many different solutions that are just, where the patient gets cared for. Nobody's thinking about that from their perspective. Nobody refers people up the chain as needed. How we think about what medications are really going to go after what unmet needs. And as soon as someone has a good medication to take care of part of their symptoms, that's off their list, because they don't talk about tremor as much. Looking at tremor in a Parkinson's population today is so much different than 20 years ago, where if I was in a room with Parkinson's patients, they were all under-medicated and they had lots of dyskinesia. I rarely see that until someone's really advanced. So there's just a misconnect that it'd be great and going for cures and better science, but I think the innovation needed now and the partnering really has to be about solving the systemic delivery of these things. And even I can go to CMS with one more. Like, we have patients, physical therapy, exercise is one of the few things that we know can benefit Parkinson's patients. And 90% of Parkinson's patients are on Medicare. 90%. So we had to fight for years to get reimbursement for physical therapy because the standard to pay was, are they getting better?
Yeah.
It's a progressive, degenerative disease. And if you do physical therapy for years, you're slowing progression, but you're never getting better. And it's like
Kind of
these
emblematic of all of
yeah.
the health and food issues that medicine can't touch partly because they're not billable. I mean, we just talked about the lack of access to doctors. That's something that you have been working on, Lisa, at Abbott. in Parkinson's.
Yeah, and actually just build on the Parkinson's example, because I'm glad to know that you think that on the science and technology side we're doing a great job, but I actually think we can do better.
I know we can.
And one of the areas that we realize with for Parkinson's patients and those with movement disorders is that we have an advanced technology for people who aren't able to get control of their symptoms. That's called a deep brain stimulator. So it's basically a pacemaker that gets implanted into your brain and sends signals to control movement. And because of the things that Debbie had mentioned, there's just only there's about 650, I think, specialists around the country. So in order to actually, if you're getting to a specialist, you're traveling like 150 miles. Right? And unfortunately, with therapies like this, they work and they tremendous improvement in quality of life and slowing the progression. The challenge is with technologies like this, you actually need to customize the programming for an individual patient. So it's basically like personalized therapy. And that requires actually visits into the hospital or the care, oftentimes an academic medical center. And just that alone can be a non-starter for people. And it's actually, we recently have developed a new platform called the Neurosphere Virtual Clinic. And now we actually allow people who get implanted, you still need to come into the hospital to get the implant put in, but then you can actually be followed and seen by a care provider in your home.
If the state allows it.
If the state allows
Yeah,
it. And
that's
so we
the other-
have worked with
right?
CMS, and so we do have a Category 3 telehealth, been able to leverage that. But you're right. But at least the technology is there. So before, those patients would have to come in, oftentimes with a family member. It would take a whole day out of work or a whole day out of their life to come in to visit a physician. And now we're actually able to do that from the comfort of their own living room. So it's game-changing for the therapy. There's still work we need to do to ensure access, but at least now that technology is there to be able to meet people where they are when they need it.
And that's an example. That's post-approval innovation,
Yeah,
right? To
exactly,
be able,
'cause
it was COVID right in the middle of COVID.
Yeah, it was right in the middle of COVID that this happened. And then we're like, okay, these people need this therapy. And even if they were to get the therapy, then they actually couldn't get the follow-on visits that they needed. And so we very quickly were able to innovate. And that's what's like literally listening to patients who had the therapy, listening to care providers saying, this is a huge unmet need for us.
I'd still say, though, we have access issues, right? I mean,
All
I
right,
don't know
Liz,
your
chime
data.
in, Liz.
Well, one access issue. I think in DBS, I don't know across all the different makers how it varies, but still, men are twice as likely to get DBS as women.
Exactly.
And, so it's really tricky. It's hard.
So I actually have a question I want to ask Jay. So I'm just going to sit there and sweat for a second. And then I'm watching the clock. So after Jay's answer, I'm going to go back to Mark, and I would love each of you to either highlight a challenge or a solution for creating the partnerships that are needed in all your different areas. More out of the box, the better, and I'm going to have to hold everybody to time. So think like something you can say in a minute. Assuming I'll give you a little more than that, but we will go down the line coming back. But I want to ask Jay about a different partnership that he has to deal with now on a daily basis as head of R&D at a publicly traded company. And now, for those of you not following, Amgen is in the race to develop the next big GLP-1, these diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular, knee surgery, sleep apnea drugs that are taking the world by storm in a big way. Yeah. And yesterday, a stock analyst who's very interested in your GLP-1 was going through and some Excel tables and found some some hidden rows that they thought might show that there might be some bone side effects to the drug that were not out there, and your stock took a bit of a dive. Do you want to comment on that? And is there anything about what's going on there that why were there these hidden tables, for instance?
Yeah, no, Matt, I'm happy to speak to it. I appreciate the chance for a clarification. I can't perfectly connect it to the theme of today's discussion.
I tried.
But
Yeah.
I did make mention earlier that through population genetics, we found this protein, this GIP receptor, the GIPR.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that, and then made a medicine to target it. And this medicine is called Maritide. And it's in a phase 2 clinical trial right now for chronic weight management. This is a medicine that we are very confident in. This is a medicine that we have characterized very thoroughly. This question relates to the phase 1 study published back in January. And we see no effect of this medicine or its administration on bone mineral density, which was the question posed. We see no effect. And we will read out the phase 2 clinical trial later this year, at which time we'll have a lot more to say about the medicine.
So you're not trying to make a denosumab, which is their bone drug, combination.
Yeah, that's a good point. We know a lot about bone health at Amgen, having made Prolia and Xgeva and Evenity, and we have all the right experts to help me say that we have no concern about this medicine and bone mineral density from this phase 1 study.
Okay, let's talk either solution, either silver bullets or at least targets, and we're going to start with Mark.
Yeah.
Give us one that you only get to pick. There's a genie out there in the audience that can make all this stuff happen, but you get one.
I think, one of the biggest things that's both a challenge and an opportunity possibly for innovation, starting on the Medicare Medicaid side, certainly possibly on the commercial side, is really trying to help CMS as a whole, not necessarily CMMI, get over, and Liz mentioned it, that the program, the system, it was all based on a 1965, 66 beneficiary. And all through the years, like we've been involved in every single, starting frankly from Amgen and Aranesp versus Procrit to today, right? Every challenge, payment and coverage. And CMS relies too much on precedent. So maybe, the Department of Government Efficiency in our next administration might be able to help, formulate how CMS can look at things, because it causes issues with the other thing Liz said, which is really true, that in order to look at quality, in order to help possibly with access and cost, you have to look at the whole patient journey. And if you're not doing that because you can't, I'll give you an easy one, right? CMS has had the opportunity, way back when United did these trials, and they looked at just literally adherence to cancer guideline and whether or not in the population in Florida, costs could go down. And they did. They went down 20%. Just literally making a doctor say that I attest I use cancer guideline. Those ideas were brought to CMS at different times. CMS can't really introduce them because of precedent. The other thing, and this gets a little to CMMI, is the rules for doing demonstration, right? They're hampered, even though they have theoretically the entire Medicare statute that they can waive. They really can't, because everything has to be completely budget neutral, go through OMB, so several hurdles.
And the actuaries.
And that, which is even worse, the actuaries. and so, I think if we could think about, what is the partnership between FDA and CMS, FDA, CMS, and private payers and states, right, on the Medicaid side. What is the opportunity, if you look at the true patient journey, to make innovation, right, that could potentially increase quality and lower cost? It would be helpful, but the agency is just not able to do it.
Liz.
Or not, and I'll say willing, but it's not really their issue. It's never,
So Liz, do you have any advice for my magical genie, or for that matter, for Ilan or Vivek?
Well, we've already discovered that I can't solve the challenges in the healthcare, and I don't have a silver bullet. I will say, and just getting to, I did want to make a point. we do have the ability to waive. For example, we were using telehealth before the pandemic. We could waive those rules. We can waive the rules that restrict home care. We can provide more care at home if that's what the patient needs. It really requires moving into these models and thinking about payment in a very different way. What hinders us is that 90% of our models are voluntary, and so providers decide to come in if it looks,
Attractive.
fortuitous from a financial perspective, and if they're not winning, they drop out. And so as a result, none of our models, or very few of our models, end up generating this savings. What we're trying to do now is look at, and maybe this is the genie and the larger bullet, is think about the spillover effect. Like, there is something that we're testing and something that we're doing, and we're finding that there's an impact on the broader healthcare system. We haven't been measuring it, we haven't been reporting on it, so we're trying to do a better job of that now, this sort of ripple effect of what we're testing. But voluntary models in piecemeal form are never going to get us to the finish line, and so we're trying to do more mandatory models, which I realize is controversial, particularly in the midst of a transition to a new administration, but we need to move in the direction that we've been advocating. It's just been very slow going.
So we need to be unprecedented. We need to sometimes mandate things in order to make them work. Lisa, you get your magic wand.
By magic wand, I would have us all really change from what is a system of sick care to truly health care. And I think that will require moving patients and care outside of the four walls of the hospital, where so much of it happens today. And there's technologies and capabilities out there around, and just think about the potential with AI, machine learning around data, and how do we actually, follow patients, or remote monitoring and at-home diagnostics, all of those things to give people the control and the information they need so they can live their healthiest lives. So right now we're just not set up that way. And if I waved a magic wand, we'd all be figuring out how to keep healthy people healthy.
Debbie?
Since all these people are going to solve a lot of the access and systemic problems, I'm going to go right back to our mission, which is to develop. I think there's a potential genie available for helping develop better treatments. And I think it centers around now, not just in Parkinson's, but also in Alzheimer's, so the two largest neurodegenerative conditions. And as long as the stats about how many people are going to live past 60, all the cancers are getting better and better treated, we will all face these conditions. And so we now have biology as an anchor. We're at the start of that. We have, just us, I mentioned before, $1 billion worth of questions that we want to run tests on existing samples of well-characterized people with these conditions. Like, we can really accelerate knowledge. And I'd love to see a world where it's not dementia mapping, but we map around biology, and we realize that Parkinson's and people over the age of 80 have all three of these misfolded proteins in their brains at autopsy. Healthy people as well as people who've been diagnosed. Alpha-synuclein, beta-amyloid, and tau. So I'd like to see a more top-down version of biology-driven focus on neurodegeneration. We're now poised to look like to capture the kind of successes in personalized medicine that we've seen in oncology, and I think it's an extraordinary time for, I'm not counting on government to pay for this, at least not in the Parkinson's side. And so I think scaling philanthropy very strategically is a big opportunity.
Jay?
I think that all of these reflections are spot on, and though we're asked to provide insights into challenges, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there's just never been a better time to solve disease problems. We have more actionable insight. We have a very organized, largely publicly funded basic research infrastructure. We have a hulking translational infrastructure within the private sector. We have therapeutic instruments that can often, but not every time, help us take the hill and make the medicine when a target is clarified. So I would start by saying, what a time to do what we're doing, and shame on us if we can, especially as leaders in these fields, work together to remove the obstacles that help innovation reach patients. But tasked with creating one challenge, and you actually said it way more eloquently than I could, the biggest piece of science that's not properly approached right now is prevention. There are very few scientists that even study prevention. Studying treatment, a lot easier. Somebody's sick, you give them a medicine with a very small number of patients. You can read out if your medicine worked. I would venture to say more than 95% of all expenditure in the private sector is to make treatments for diseases. We and a small number of other companies are very interested in prevention. We study cardiovascular disease. I talked about PCSK9 and LDL. I talked about olpasiran and Lp(a). It's not accidental. The population data that we harvest largely gives you prevention signals. Why did these people not get this disease? They had the GIPR mutation, right? It may or may not be true that their disease can be treated that way, but the development of the disease is the signal. And believe it or not, most of the medicines that we use in preventive medicine are born as treatments. That can work. Think of statins, think of cholesterol, think of the 2 medicines that I mentioned from our portfolio. But what targets would you discover if you weren't actually interested in treating Parkinson's at all, but making sure you never got it? It's a very narrow sliver of the public and private sector that think about precision prevention. And if we've learned anything from vaccination, when it works, those people don't have the disease, they never received it, they never developed it. And so I think that we, capital W, could do a much better job organizing and harvesting and training people to think about the biology, the targets, the medicines, the clinical trials, the biomarkers, the pathways, maybe even the devices that deliver more optimal prevention of disease.
So Liz asked a question that actually I can tell from this fascinated the audience. And we could probably do a whole nother panel on it, but we've got 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Mark, cost or quality if you have to pick one as a measure?
Quality. And
Liz?
I already gave my answer.
Quality.
Quality.
It's not the way it works. I mean, I just hate to say it.
Can always count on you.
You know, it's like, it's true for making medicines, like in remodeling your house. Cost, quality, and speed, pick any 2 of 3. And we try to optimize all 3 of these things. It's just, it's a 3-variable equation. It gets solved. It often takes too long to solve it. But I can't answer a
Well, that's
question.
that you don't
just
get
not the
the
way it
speed.
works.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of you. I think this was a great conversation. I wish I could get to the question about how to deliver innovations in emerging markets, but I don't think we're going to deal with that in a minute and 51 seconds. Does anyone want to raise their hand to make a final closing? No? We're done? All right, well, thank you so much. Jay likes to talk, so I'm actually going to let him run out the clock. What does Debbie have to do to get you to work on a Parkinson's drug?
I was just going to tell him I have something that I wanted to talk to him about.
The panel's going to continue in
Yeah,
the room.
I think that's about to happen over coffee.
that's funny.
We did exit neuroscience a few years ago, but what would get us right back in is an actionable insight that we would be the right medicines company to develop that drug. So let's have coffee.
Yeah,
All right.
there we
Well,
go.
we're gonna have coffee.
Thank you
so
for
much,
joining
everyone.
this discussion.